My name is Rebecca Nhep, for those I haven't had the privilege of meeting before. I am the Senior Technical Advisor of the Better Care Network, which is a global network that was originally established by UNICEF, USAID and Save the Children UK, and is now the global network that manages the information management and knowledge management agenda of the care sector, as well as creates platforms and opportunities for collaboration and convening the major actors and organisations who work in this aspect of child protection, and also looks at the advocacy agenda around ensuring that policy and practice, both at the regional and the national levels, are technically sound and in line with the international norms and guidelines. Prior to working with BCN, I was the joint CEO of ACC International, which is the missions and development agency of the Australian Christian churches in Australia. And with ACC International, we developed a care reform program called Connected, which worked across multiple countries, supporting primarily faith-based organisations in their efforts to transition away from the use of institutional care for children towards family-based care and family and community strengthening and preservation programs. And prior to that, I lived and worked in Cambodia in the field of child protection and supporting the development of the country's first family-based care program that is now being integrated with government, and also on developing a network of community and family strengthening programs that were all church-led and running and operating in over 100 rural communities that were at high risk of family separation, primarily due to poverty and economic related factors. So I'm speaking to you today coming from a variety of different backgrounds, both inside the faith world, from a field perspective, but also looking at this but more from a global standpoint. And this session today is really to unpack and expand a little bit on what we were talking about last night, for those of you who were there for the plenary sessions last night when we introduced this concept of systems and system strengthening. So today we're going to dig a fair bit deeper and a more technical look at that whole concept of how we work towards achieving a vision of a world where all children are able to grow up in safe and loving families by looking at that through the lens of how do we approach and address this current issue of children who are separated from families and living in institutions, and get from the starting point of where we are to where we want to be in order to see our vision achieved and realised. So we know that there are, as I said, 2 to 8 million. The statistics are still pretty unclear. There is new information and statistics that are being gathered and collated at the moment, and so we expect to see some better data coming out soon. But at this point, we still have quite a broad range of the number of children who are in institutional care settings. And we do know from the extensive body of evidence that most of these children are not orphans in the true sense. Most of these children have families. Up to 80% of these children have at least one living parent, and the vast majority of these children do have families, be that extended families or kin, who could support these children if they were given adequate support. So we understand that in order to get to this vision of a world without orphans, we need to really look at this issue of children who are in institutions and the mechanisms by which we can support these families and support the safe and effective reintegration of these children back into family and community life. And we know that that's an important part of achieving this vision, not only because those children are currently separated from families and living outside of family-based care, but we also know from an extensive body of research and evidence that's been collated over upwards of a 70-year period now, that institutional care is not in children's best interests. Before we dig too much deeper into this, I do want to draw a distinction between institutional care as a type and a setting and a nature of care, a regime of care, we often refer to it, and the broader category of residential care. So what we're seeing happen at the moment in a lot of the global debates is a bit of a conflation, or a bit of a confusion between what those two terms are. Now, institutional care does cover the vast majority of residential care settings, but there are residential care settings that are not institutional in their nature or in the care regime that is provided. And the alternative care guidelines, which we will talk a little bit more about later in this session, do create space in the continuum of care for some residential care as a last resort and a temporary measure for children, but it is organised around small groups, group-based care that is organised as closely as possible to a family-like setting. And so just as we're talking about institutional care, some of the reactions that we're seeing at the moment is people are interpreting that to say there is no place for any residential care. There is a place for some residential care within the continuum, but it is this smaller group type care, and it is not for institutional care. The global push is away from the use of institutional care because we know it is incredibly harmful and creates a range of detriments for children, some of which you can see up there on the screen right now. We know from the research that institutional type residential care creates psychological harm for children. We know that it creates developmental delays, cognitive delays, physical developmental delays, emotional and psychological developmental delays. We know that children who grow up in institutions are more likely to experience poor life skills, poor decision-making skills, that they lack the social networks and the social skills that they need when they leave care to enable them to thrive in society. We know that many children who live in institutions who have been separated from families experience different types of attachment disorders. And for anyone who's ever worked in an institution or visited an institution, particularly if you're a visitor, and you may have seen children run up to you and hug you, and you have witnessed this thing where you think these children are incredibly happy and friendly, most times that's actually an expression of a reactive attachment disorder. Because if you compare that behaviour with a child who has a secure attachment with a primary caregiver, you will recognise and understand that that type of indiscriminate friendliness is actually atypical for a child and is actually quite unhealthy. And not only does it demonstrate that that child may have an attachment disorder, it also puts that child at extreme risk of being exploited, particularly if that child carries that indiscriminate friendliness into their young adult life when they leave care. And that brings us to the next category, which is not only does the effects of institutionalisation affect children during their childhood and during their time in a care environment, but it also has ramifications for their adulthood. I think we heard this morning that whole concept of we don't stop being an orphan when we become 18. The same thing goes for children who grow up in institutions and who are affected by institutionalisation. They carry those effects into their adult life, and it can create a range of risks and detriments to young people, including a high likelihood of stigmatization. In many countries and cultures, even being having the label of being an orphan or having the label of being a child who comes from an institution is a stigma in the community that those children and young people carry. Young people who leave care are more likely to experience homelessness. They are more likely to struggle both securing employment and also retaining employment. And some of that comes down to the lack of social skills and life skills that we mentioned in the earlier slide. Young people who leave care are also more likely to experience a range of mental health challenges. They are more likely to commit suicide or experience and suffer from suicidal ideation. They are more likely to experience abuse, violence, neglect, exploitation, and they are more susceptible to being trafficked, whether that is into labour trafficking, whether that is into sex trafficking, or whether that is into trafficking into criminal gangs. And that also leads to a higher rate of incarceration for children who have grown up, young people who have grown up in institutional care. And so what this research makes clear for us is that we really need to move away from providing this type of care to children. We need to be looking at different types of alternative care with a high priority placed on family-based care. But as we mentioned earlier, many of the children who are currently in institutional care settings may not need alternative care. What they might actually need is family support services that enable them to live with their families of origin, including their extended families. So when we think about this challenge of the 2 to 8 million children who are currently in these institutions and the challenge of returning them to families and communities where that is safe and in their best interest, we can often think about that challenge at the programmatic level, at the level of each individual institution or orphanage or children's home or whatever it might be called in that particular context. And we think about it at the case level. How do we transition this particular and specific group of children back into families and into communities? And this is incredibly important because this is exactly one of the processes that needs to happen. But we also need to think about how do we do that in a way that is long-term sustainable? How do we do that in a way that is safe and effective? How do we do that with all the challenges that face us when we think about that kind of work, including, many institutions, children don't come from the immediate community where that institution might be located. They come from all over the country. The majority of residential care centres are located in either urban or semi-urban areas, yet the majority of these children are coming from rural areas. And so we have a huge logistical challenge on our hands when we try to think about how do we start to look at the reintegration of these children and the transition of these services, because it's not all in one local community. It spreads us all around the country. And so what that leads us to understand is that the transformation of these individual services needs to be connected to the transformation of the entire service systems that seek to protect children and protect their families. And this is what we often talk about as care reform. Care reform is broader than just, looking at the transition of institutions and the reintegration of children. Care reform is looking at reforming the entire systems of care for families and children in a given country. And so in this session, we're going to look at a bit of an overview of what the system is, what its components are. We're going to break it down step by step and have a look at what's in the system, and then look at some strategies that we might be able to employ within our own ministries and organisations and churches to actually participate in strengthening and building that system. And my hope is that it will help to build a little bit more knowledge around the systems agenda that you will be able to take away, but also help us to develop a strong commitment to this system strengthening agenda, which can sound a little bit high up, a little bit scary, a little bit hard to connect with at times. But I assure you, every ministry and every organisation can find their place in the system and can find a way to make a legitimate contribution to building the system. So those of you who were in the plenary last night would have heard me say that our vision is entirely dependent on this. So if we're serious about the vision of a world without orphans, then we must become more committed and more serious about this system's strengthening agenda. So if we quickly look at what a system actually is by definition, it is a coherent set of actions and actors in which the child is the starting point and which aims to guarantee the rights and well-being of the child by constructing synergies within and between protective environments. Part I like the best about that is the synergies within and between the protective environments. That is encompassing the community level, the family as a protective environment, the community as a protective environment. It encompasses other spaces such as schools and education, right up to the bigger picture systems and services that protect children. It is about making linkages from the very grassroots level right through to the top of the systems. So most of us might have come into this line of work working with vulnerable children from that programmatic lens. That's certainly my background. As I shared with you earlier, my starting point was working in Cambodia and working alongside of an organisation that was developing foster care there, as well as some of these community strengthening programs. So I was definitely coming into this issue looking at it from a programs perspective. And I think what my experience has taught me over time is that, you come to these situations where you look at how big the issues are and you realise that your organisation is making a critical contribution, but sometimes it's a drop in the ocean. Unless we can see other drops in the ocean, other contributions from other organisations and government services coming together to wrap around a child and a family, because otherwise our services in isolation are quite insufficient when it comes to meeting some of the complex needs that we face in these communities. So that might be your starting point as well. But as we have more experience with reintegrating children, we become aware that we need to collaborate. We need to work in partnership with others. We need to become a part of the system that is being developed in each of our countries. And so I want to share with you some of the top reasons I think it's worth looking at your work and your program from a systems strengthening agenda. Firstly, systems enable the majority of children to realise their rights and access to the protection services that they need. Programs respond to specific children. They respond to specific children facing specific issues. They're usually not quite well equipped to respond to the holistic scope of services that a child needs, the holistic scope of rights that a child needs to be able to realise to really be able to flourish. And services are unable to meet the needs of all children, only a small cohort of children, whereas systems are able to meet the needs of all children. Systems are holistic. They are multifaceted. They contain services starting from the prevention and early intervention, universal services that are for all children, right up to the very pointy end of child protection interventions in situations of high risk and crisis. They're holistic. That means they're able to support children as their situations also transform and transition. It supports children throughout their entire childhood, not just at one point when they might be facing one specific set of issues. Systems also provide greater consistency and continuity. When we are working at a programmatic level and all of our programs are disconnected from the system, the standards are all dependent on the organisation. There's no quality control, there's no consistency. And so that means that children are subject to whatever standards that particular organisation that may have reached out to them are able to provide. Whereas part of a system is actually looking at standards of care, standards of practice, standards of operation, standardising procedures of operation so that no matter which service a child might enter into or receive or benefit from, they are all going to receive at least the same minimum standard of care, which means that children's experience within the system and being supported by the system becomes more consistent and more aligned with their best interests. Systems create durable outcomes. They create sustainable outcomes. Systems are able, as we said, to support children over a broader length of time and over a broader range of issues. But systems also reinforce the actions of others. So that's the collaboration part of it. So you might be making one contribution to a child's life, but the impact of your contribution is being increased by the impact of another service's contribution that child also needs. And so we see more durable outcomes because holistic needs are being met, which is necessary for long-term impacts in children's lives. Systems also promote government ownership and capacity building and subsequently sustainability within those countries. Now, that is one of the greatest strengths and one of the greatest rationales for working in a systems reform way. But it's also one of the most frustrating. Many of us will have experience working with governments in our own countries that are really frustrating. We might find governments inflexible. We might find governments slow to act. We might be frustrated. They are under-resourced in many contexts where care reform is happening. And all of this creates a very live set of challenges and frustrations that makes us sometimes want to sidestep government and work independently. We might be able to get things done faster that way. Then we might be able to be more fluid that way. We might be able to, get something up and running more quickly that way. But it comes at the expense of the long-term sustainability of the service systems in those countries. So it's absolutely critical to do whatever you need to do, drink as much coffee as you need to drink to be able to stay in the game with your government in order to strengthen their system. Prepare yourself for all of that frustration because it will certainly come, but we need to be able to build those systems if at the end of the day they are government owned and run and at some point in time hopefully funded, then they are sustainable. And that's what we need to be working towards. We see so many situations where we have NGO run services that pop up and they support children well for the life of the program, but when the funding dries up, the program is gone and those children are outside of the system and no longer supported. So we need sustainable, government-owned and run systems. So we're going to, as I said, look into the system, but I just want to recognise that although we are going to be digging into some of the generic components of a system, that systems are going to look very different in each of your countries and your cultural context. And so you might see some of the same components, but how they work and how they're expressed are going to be very different, which means that one of the first things we need to do in order to participate in system strengthening is learn about the system that is being developed in our countries, because each one is going to be quite different. Systems are influenced by culture. One example of that is in Cambodia, where I have a lot of experience and Dan's got a lot of experience and maybe some others in the room as well. If you look at Cambodia's family code, which is one of the key pieces of legislation that governs children's care, and if you look at that, it's enshrined in that piece of legislation the obligations of parents towards their children, the rights of children and the obligations of parents. That's all very normal for me coming from a Western country. What's not normal for me to see coming from Australia is the second part of that particular paragraph in the law says, and in reverse, when children are adults, they have a legal responsibility to care for their parents in their older age. So that is a component of the system that is very much shaped by Cambodia, which is a collectivist culture. It has a reciprocal obligation between people, including between parents and children. And so that influence of collectivism has shaped components of the system, just to give you an example. You know, systems are shaped by political situations. We see that the care systems and the child protection systems in some of the Eastern European countries that are heavily influenced by socialism are very, very different to, for example, the system that we have in Australia, which is a very neoliberal political system that believes a lot in capitalism and market forces. And so in the Eastern European countries, the systems are very state-run. Whereas in my country, in Australia, because of that political influence, the system is highly privatised. The government puts in place laws, regulations, makes funding available, and then expects organisations to bid for that funding and expects the market to determine that the competition within the sector, and that drives the system. And so you'll see very different systems based on political influences. Also, economic influences, obviously, create huge differences in systems. And not only in how systems are being developed in terms of what they look like, but also the rate of their development. Depending on the economic resources of that country, you're going to see great variances in systems. And that's also in regard to particular rights of children allowed for under international law. There is a thing called progressive realisation, which is recognised in many of the international conventions, particularly those that deal with social and economic and cultural rights, that the progressive realisation means that it's up to states to prioritise, based upon the resources they have, to realise a progressively greater scope of children's rights over time. That means that not everything's going to be there at once, because we need to realise the economic realities of the governments and countries in which care reform is taking place. So that also influences not only the shape of the system, the rate at which it's developing, but also what is being prioritised. The other thing that really shapes systems is national laws and international laws and norms, which we sort of touched on a little bit already. So what's important to understand is often we look at what's already happening in the system and we say, well, that's where the system's at. But also when we're looking at systems reform, we have to look ahead and say, well, what externally is influencing the system? And that gives us a bit of a roadmap as to where things are going to go, which is helpful for us as we work to strengthen the system. And one of the key things that influences the system from outside is the international norms, the treaties or conventions that governments have become state party to by ratifying. The primary treaties that impact upon children's care are the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I'm sure most of us in the room are very well familiar with. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, because that pertains to children with disabilities in care and has quite a strong influence on how care reform agendas are being shaped at this point in history. And also the Guidelines on the Alternative Care for Children, which were adopted under a UN resolution. So they are an amendment in a UN resolution that were adopted by all member states in 2009. So we've got the 10-year anniversary this year. And they unpack and provide authoritative guidance on how member states implement their treaty obligations towards children who require parental care, who are outside of parental care, who require alternative care, but also around obligations to strengthen families so that parents can actually fulfill their caregiving responsibilities to children, and we prevent separation where it's not necessary or in children's best interest. So there's some of the things we can look at to understand what's going to happen in the system. How is the system going to move forward, and what is shaping the system? The other thing that it's important to look at is what systems are supposed to actually do. Because we need to know, again, what is this vision that we're going after? What does the system need to be able to do? And the system needs to be able to fulfill children's rights at the very bottom there. That is, the main purpose of the system is to work towards the progressive realisation of children's rights. The next one is to support parents and caregivers to fulfil their caregiving responsibilities and obligations. I remember quite a number of years ago now, but I had an aha moment when I realised, parents are actually rights holders under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. You know, it's not just the children, but also the parents have rights enshrined in that treaty. Governments have a responsibility to provide support to parents so that they can outwork that caregiving role. And so that's also a requirement and obligation of the system. The next one is to meet children's needs. Now, obviously, all children have needs, but many children's needs can be adequately met in community and through family. But for some children, that's not going to be possible, and so the system needs to be able to respond to children whose needs are not being met and make sure those needs can be met. And again, at that very pointy end, the system needs to be able to respond to risk of harm, to risk of situations that are going to place that children in a very precarious situation, or situations where the well-being concerns are so great and so high that it's considered a significant risk of harm. And so that's where your child protection interventions really start to come in. So again, if we start breaking this concept of systems down, we can see that it sort of starts to break down into a couple of categories. And we can look at all of the service systems that support families and children in two primary categories, being prevention and responsive. So using the World Without Orphans roadmap terminology, we would look at that as prevention, and we would look at that as intervention. Different countries use different terms, but that's another way of phrasing the same thing. And so here we have these two categories of prevention and intervention. And what we can see there is at the top you've got you've got a little sort of triangle box there that looks at what the threshold is for those services to really kick into place, and what the service systems are that are designed to respond to those thresholds. So the first one there in prevention, you've got for all children. These are our universal services. It doesn't matter whether you are the king's child and come from the wealthiest family in the country, you are also able to access a full range of universal services on the basis of just being a child. They are things like education and healthcare, birth registration, identity cards and documentation. All of those things are our universal services, and they prevent situations of vulnerability. We see that very clearly with children who are stateless, or children who are migrants who don't have legal identity in countries, which means they can't access schooling, they can't access social services, which tends to create a situation which snowballs into high risk for that child. So that is part of the prevention system. We also have the second tiers there. We have social protection, and we also have family strengthening. So if we look at social protection, they are our services and systems that are designed to reduce poverty and vulnerability and act as safety nets for families. So they can include things like cash transfers, in-kind transfers. They can include things like housing, employment. Social protection services and policies are also things like positive employment policies in some countries. So in my country, for example, the government has a new policy on trying to incentivize employment of people who are over 55 and getting close to retirement. That's an example of a social protection mechanism. So it can be policy, it can also be service. And again, these are low risk, low threshold. It's basically coming in at the threshold of having, meeting some kind of economic threshold that would qualify you from accessing your social protection services. So they are targeted, but a very low level. The next one down is the family strengthening services. And so these are specific to families and to children, and they're designed to stabilize families who are demonstrating, a low to moderate degree of vulnerability. It can often be, again, economic, but it can also be other things. So the threshold there is some unmet needs and low-level risks. And family strengthening services can be things like economic activities to increase income. It can be community development initiatives. It can be supportive services that help particular groups of children and families access education. Sometimes some countries have services for children who are migrants and might speak a different language to what is taught in school. There might be special education services for those children. They would also be examples of that. It is supported access to childcare. It can be low cost or free childcare for families, again, who meet a particular threshold and would be considered vulnerable. It can be vocational training, counselling, mentoring, a range of different services. So the next category after that is our responsive or our intervention services. And here we start to see the threshold jumping up a bit to higher unmet needs and medium level risks. And that's when your family preservation services start to kick in. And at that tier there, you're looking at more intensive social work programs generally. So in some countries, you'll see that's where there'll be a specialised social worker assigned to a very small number of cases of children who have very intensive support from those social workers over a short period of time to try to deal with situations that have been deemed at that medium risk level, where the goal is really to try to prevent the further escalation of that risk and the breakdown of that family. So it can be family therapy. Some families might be required to participate in parenting programs or different things like that. And it can also be intensive life skills. The next one up from that is our child protection services. And nested inside our child protection services is where we find alternative care. And so when we get to child protection, we are looking at significant unmet needs and high risk. So in some countries, the terminology that would be used is risk of significant harm, is the threshold for a child protection intervention. And that is where interventions can be they can be home-based, or it could be to the point where they require the removal of the child from that particular situation, and that is where we would start to see alternative care. And so the alternative care, I'll go through these, sorry. There we go. So alternative care is nested inside of that child protection, and we understand that alternative care is a continuum of services. And in each country, we need to have a continuum of services available, again, so that we can meet the best needs of every child. I think one of the things we've been hearing throughout this conference is that we can't just have all of one thing. There's no silver bullets here. We can't all jump from residential care and now we're all going to do foster care, or now we're all going to do adoption. We need to have the full continuum of services available, because what's in the best interest of one child is not going to be in the best interest of another child. And so we need to be able to refer children to the service that is most appropriate to them. So here we have, a range of services, including those that are family-based, and some of those are not situations that are alternative care. They are family of origin, but they're also considered family-based care. You've got things like, in some countries, there are mechanisms to support child-headed households. You've also got kinship care, which can be, in some countries, they will differentiate between close kinship relationships or more distant. Some countries don't make that differentiation, but you have kinship care and you have foster care. And so kinship care sometimes is considered permanent, and it's not considered alternative care, and it's not always considered formal, and that's absolutely fine. The majority of children who are separated from parents actually live in kinship care, and that's considered family of origin care as well, and is fine. Then you've also, in some countries, got this category of community-based care. This is based primarily on the Cambodian system. Not all countries have that group there. And in that group in Cambodia, they include faith-based care or pagoda-based care. It's a Buddhist country, and so there is a tradition of care being provided in local temples, and it's designed to really cover that group of care. And then we have our residential care services, including the group home care, the family-like residential care, and in our larger institutions. Obviously, the institutions is what we are trying to phase out. We are trying to transition away from, but we need to make sure we do retain some form of residential care that is small, that is group-oriented, and that is designed around the needs of individual children, and that is as family-like as possible in its nature. We have within the continuum alternative care that is temporary and alternative care that is permanent. Obviously, the goal for every child is permanency, but children may need to come into temporary care first before that determination is made that they can return to family that becomes permanent, or that they go into a permanent placement via domestic adoption. So that's just a bit of a look at the alternative care system within the child protection system. If we look at the whole thing put together, essentially our systems are these group of systems that all have different services packed into them. And what we need to be doing is investing in the entire system. What we've seen to date, and we talked about at the beginning, we have this situation where we have 2 to 8 million children in institutions. It's because we overinvested in the pointy end. In the very pointy end of the pointy end, for that matter. We overinvested in one type of alternative care. But what we need to be doing is making sure our financial and our human resources is being poured into the whole system, so that that whole system can develop and be balanced and flourish. And that's when we're going to be able to meet the needs of children based on their best interests, not based on the services that we have at our disposal. So this is what we are working towards. Now, if we think about the care system, in particular, we need to look, in order to understand how the care system is being developed in our countries and being structured, these are the two underpinning principles of the guidelines for the alternative care for children. And they are the necessity principle and the suitability principle. And if you've got a good handle on these two principles, not only does it guide your case-by-case decision-making around children, what services they need, it also guides systems development because it has an influence on what services we need to develop so that those two principles can be upheld at a case-by-case, a child-by-child level. So the first principle we see there is the necessity principle. And this is just taken from the Moving Forward manual, which you can all find and download online, developed by an interagency manual, but primarily developed by Celsus. And it is a great resource in terms of unpacking the guidelines on the alternative care of children. It's very practical. It's very easy to engage with. And this is a graphic that is taken from there. And this really looks at the first principle of necessity being, is care genuinely needed? Does this child genuinely require outside of family or outside of parental care? Do they need to be removed and placed into an alternative care situation? And that principle is where we find primarily our gatekeeping mechanisms. And gatekeeping is about creating gates, creating moments where we stop and we try to avert the flow of children into alternative care where it's not necessary by asking ourselves questions. What does this child actually need? If they need education, then the answer is education, not alternative care. If they need economic strengthening in the family, that gatekeeping mechanism prevents us from referring those children to a service that, yes, may meet those economic needs directly, but the issue is family poverty, so we need to refer them to social protection services and mechanisms. So the necessity principle is about asking, what does a child need? And then how do we refer that child to the services that best match their needs and best address the issues that are creating situations of vulnerability in their lives? And again, that has to be asked at a systems level as well because it dictates the direction of resources towards the services that we don't have that prevent us from upholding the necessity principle when we do have a child who needs some type of support. The second principle there is suitability. And so once we have determined that a particular child does require alternative care, or if we're looking at it from a systems perspective, when we are looking at developing the alternative care subsystem there, we need to make sure we are directing children towards the type of care that is most suitable, which is why, again, we need that full continuum of care options, why it's not okay in a system just to have one type of care. We need to be able to respond to the different needs of children. So that again has an implication for directing resource, it has an implication for service providers, looking at what types of interventions we should develop based on which of those alternative care services don't currently exist or areas where they are inadequate in their provision. And the suitability principle at a case level is really asking about what does this child need? And this also takes into account the clear prioritization of families that we see reflected in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, in the CRPD and also in the guidelines. So it means that we need to first and foremost look at whether or not a family placement is going to be in the best interest of the child, recognising that families are fundamental to children's growth, well-being and development. So it creates a prioritisation, but it still allows us to assess what's in that child's best needs. And so to uphold that principle, we need to have the continuum services. We also need to have all the coordination and referral mechanisms in place. We need to be doing things like developing the social workforce. If we don't have trained and qualified social workers, who's going to make these decisions? Who's going to do these assessments? If the assessments are ineffective because the social workers are undertrained, then the placements are not necessarily going to be in the best interest of children. So it starts to shape and show us what we need to be doing in order to develop a system that will actually meet the interests of these children. It looks at whether or not our laws and policies as they stand, do they reflect these prioritisations on family? Or do the legal frameworks need to be updated and amended? It affects looking at the bodies and the authorities that make these decisions. Do you have things like in India, they call them CCWCs. In Cambodia, we have commune councils. Different countries have different local bodies who are responsible for looking at a child's case and making a decision about referral. You know, in many countries right now, we're seeing that that's the weak point in the system, where we have these local authorities who have a mandate, who have authority and a responsibility, but don't have the training to outwork those decisions effectively. And so we're seeing children sometimes kept in families where it's unsafe, and we're seeing other children referred to institutions where it's not in their best interest. So there are some of the things that need to be developed in the system to uphold the suitability principle. So when we look at the care system, this puzzle up here is sort of the major categories of what the care system are. And these are the different things we need to have in place to ensure that system can function. We need proper laws and a policy framework. We need implementation mechanisms. That's, all the local authorities, the referral processes, monitoring, evaluation, inspection, standards, all those kinds of things. We need the range of services, both the preventative services that prevent family breakdown and support families, and the child protection and the alternative care services. We need the human resources, both within government and within civil society, within the broader workforce, including judiciary, police, and we need material resources. We need the money. We need the resources to actually enable these services to be well-functioning. And those resources need to be appropriately directed so we avoid that situation where we have overinvestment and underinvestment. In some countries, we need the reform piece. That's the deinstitutionalization component. We need a strategic plan to guide deinstitutionalization so that we don't have situations like we've seen in recent years where governments turn up at children's homes and say, in 2 days' time, we will be shutting you down and sending all your children home, because we know that's unsafe. That is not going to uphold the best interests of those children if it's not done strategically and safely. So we need a reforms strategy. We also need the informal system. And that is community, that's local church, that is extended family. These are not regulated parts of the puzzle. These are your normative, organic organisations at the community level, which many of us are involved in, that need to also be there to support children and families at that more grassroots level. And then we need the alternative care system. So that is just a bit of a look at what the system is. And then I want to turn to looking at what do we do with all this information, with all this knowledge and understanding about what a system is. If we are working more at the local level or the programs level, what can we actually tangibly do to contribute towards a system strengthening agenda? The first thing is to make sure you situate your program or your response within that overall vision for a child protection and care system. So we need to identify how our programs contribute to the system. What part of the system are we located in? Are we in the services piece of the puzzle? Are we in the informal services piece of the puzzle? Where does our existing ministry or work actually find itself? And then we need to try and understand the system. We need to understand, how do we do that? If we're running a ministry or program, how do we do that in collaboration with others? Are we currently working with the local government or the national government? Do we know who else is in our area, in our city or community, who's also providing services to children? Are we connected together? Are there case management systems that the government's using that we're not using? Have we developed a different one? Can we use the one that the government is using so that information can feed into the national system? So it's looking at understanding where you fit and then how you can make sure you fit through interlocking yourself with others who are also within that piece of the puzzle. It's making sure we don't do things in isolation. We don't do things by ourselves, and we don't create alternative mechanisms where the government has a mandated mechanism. So that might look like, if you are taking children into a small group home program, it's making sure that you are not allowing parents or others to come and drop a child off at your door and accepting that child in. If there is a government body who is responsible for making those referrals, at that point it's about then making sure we support that family to access the proper assessment systems that need to happen in order to make that determination, or refer that family to a more appropriate service that might be able to keep them together. So it's about understanding what the mechanisms are and making sure we use them rather than creating our own alternatives. It's also, as we are developing new programs or new services or new interventions, that we look at what the system needs. So mapping out what's already happening in your community or your country and looking at what's not happening. And I think we need to take that bold shift of, rather than lamenting what's not happening, of being proactive people who fulfill those gaps, who look at that as a challenge that we can tackle and say, okay, there's currently not enough family strengthening services in our community. So rather than start another small group home, we're going to tackle that. We're going to provide that service to families because the system is showing us that that is a gap area. So it's making decisions in that way. Also geographically, in most countries where I've worked, what we've seen is that there is an over-proliferation in services in urban areas. But the majority of children who need those services are in rural areas. And the reason why is it's because it's a lot easier as an NGO to work somewhere that has stable power, proper water, and good internet. Yes, but that may not be where the children live. And so what we tend to see is all these amazing services in communities where the children don't necessarily need them, or the scope of services is beyond, way beyond what the needs actually are. We've got communities in Cambodia, there's a rubbish dump there that became very famous through to a set of documentaries. We've got organisations fighting over families and children in that rubbish dump because everybody wants to work there. And you've got families whose children are going to 3 different education programs. They're on 3 different sponsorship programs. They're all fighting over children. But then we've got all these other areas of the country where there's no services. There's no NGOs working anywhere to be seen. And so we need to make sure that we're making decisions about where we base ourselves based on where the geographical gaps in the systems are. And then link your services in. Talk to your local government, talk to other organisations, go and knock on UNICEF's door or one of the bigger child protection agencies, and do what you can to understand how you can link into the formal coordination mechanisms. Particularly if there's networks or working groups, join them. If there's an interagency child protection group or an alternative care working group, as there are in many countries, join that group, because that's where you're going to learn lots of information and you're going to be able to contribute, and you're going to quickly understand what's needed at a systems level, and then look at how you can contribute. The next one is to plan for scalability and sustainability. We need to make sure that our programs are contextually and culturally relevant to the community that we're in, so that we can scale up and so that we can be sustainable. One of the things that I'm a little bit worried about in the current state of play at the moment is cookie cutter programs. This concept that we can export and import things. What we see as successful in one context can be uprooted and then planted somewhere else, and we can expect to see the same degree of success. What we need to understand is the reason why programs flourish in particular areas is because they are responding to very specific cultural, political, economic dynamics in that location. And therefore, if we take a program outside of those dynamics and put them somewhere where all those factors are very different, that program may not work. It may not be relevant, it may not be effective, it may even do damage. It may undermine coping mechanisms within that community and culture that are actually quite positive. And so it's really important that we fight with everything in us to resist that urge to look at something shiny somewhere else and import it where we are. We have to understand that there just aren't quick fixes. These are complex issues. There aren't ways we can learn from others, absolutely, but we can't import and export models in their entirety. Learn from what people do, but then contextualize it to your context, to your culture, to your community, because if you don't, it won't be sustainable. It won't be able to integrate properly into the system and be sustained. Make sure that you are developing monitoring and evaluation and learning frameworks around what you do. It's really important that we're capturing what's happening. It's really important that we have data and information to contribute to the system. You know, we can all stand up and tell a great story about how a child in our program's life has been impacted, but until we have data to back up whether or not that story represents statistically represents the majority of children in our programs, we can't say that that program is effective. And so we're not giving a balanced picture, which means we're not giving information into the system that can help the system learn, oh, there's a program that is really working well in this context. We should scale it. Governments won't scale programs without evidence. So if you're cottoned onto a good thing, if you've found a really effective approach in your community, monitor it, evaluate it, collect data, track what's happening, put that data in some kind of a report or learning tool and share it as widely as you can. But if you're only sharing stories, we can't scale things up and we can't effectively learn from each other. So that's a really good way to contribute to the system. Also, we can, what have I got here? There we go. So that's the data, sorry. So there's some of the primary ways I think that we can really contribute towards building a system if we are operating at the programmatic level. Now, some of you might actually be called to work directly with government or in government. And that's obviously another really effective location or positioning by which you can influence the system. But it's really important that if you are at that programmatic level, which is absolutely fine, it's absolutely needed. So please don't hear that I'm discouraging people from working in services or programs, but I'm encouraging you to make sure your programs and services link into the system and contribute towards the system. I want to, before we just go to question time, I just want to show you a quick video because I want to give you a tangible example of how an organisation in Cambodia, Children and Families, actually supported by GHR, Dan, who's sitting over here with us. This is a great example of where a small grassroots organisation looked at a gap in the system and responded and developed an intervention that responded to a systems gap, and now that learning is being captured, it is being shared with government, and it is looking at being scaled across the country. And I think this is a really good encouraging story of, you know, we don't have to just look at those gaps and go, well, we have to just keep doing what we're doing because there's a gap. We can be those people that fill that gap. It will be challenging. It will be trial and error. We have to test things. We have to tweak things. We have to learn from our mistakes. We have to be humble to admit that we've made mistakes and we're going to have to shift our approach. But if we can push through all of that and come out with great examples of how systems gaps could be filled, that's one of the best contributions we can make to the child protection systems within our country so that those things can be scaled. This is an example of an organisation that provides foster care in Cambodia, but more importantly, they recognised one of the primary gaps in the system was around children with disabilities. You know, one thing we're all really worried about right now is that children with disabilities are going to be left behind as care reform happens. They're going to be ones that are left in the institutions when all the other children have gone home because there aren't enough disability services accessible to them in the community. And that's a really hard thing to develop in lots of countries and contexts where there's no speech therapy services, there's no of those aligned health services available. But we have to find ways of stepping up and helping them to emerge and develop, because unless we do, children with disabilities are going to be denied their rights, including their right to grow up in a family, and they are going to be the children who are left behind in institutions. So I want to show you this video so that you can get a sense of what this organisation, Children and Families, has done in order to ensure that all children, including children with disabilities, can live in families and be well supported in both foster families, in families of origin, in kinship families, and in adoptive families. Just have to bring this over here and connect it to the sound, and then we'll watch this video.
Nông ca đạn cua khmei nước nông cua xa thmấy cứ ở vậy để dân thưa dân mình tập đó dân thưa ca phim ấy cứ dân ban thưa ca sắc xa từ lưỡi cua xa năng ta bạn để bắt cua xa còn bắt nâng chẳng mình.
We also have recognized how important it is that our staff build really trusting relationships. It's really important that the families know that we are on their side.
Bây dân thưa ca năng dân đa tua nị ti chỉ đôi chia sẻ chắc cua xa còn môi chân dân ai đa tua nị ti chỉ bọc cật lắc ấy và xin chỉ dân đa tua nị ti chỉ bọc cật lắc dân mình ai thưa ca cho mỗi cua xa ban cua xa miên tầm nục chật mà lời dư vậy để dân thưa ca cho mỗi cua xa cứ ca xã cá cứ miên thiệp sầm khẩn và xin chỉ dân ăn miên ca cho rung bị cua xa tê dân tận đó dân thưa tại dân cua xa nơi tại cua xa cứ ở vậy đại không mình từ bán cứ tật tê.
We try to make it part of our assessment that we find out about their routines and what areas are impacted by the child's disability so that we can help the family in addressing those things. We know that if the family to care for this child has to withdraw from aspects of their life, aspects of their community, that will add stress. It's going to just make it harder for the family, and it also isn't really what we want for the child either. We want full inclusion in their communities as well as in their families.
បើសិនជាយើងអត់ដោះស្រាយបញ្ហានៃការរើសអើងហើយភាពស្មុគស្មាញគ្រួសារទេការប្រឈមមុខនឹងការបោះបង់ក្មេងគឺមានភាពកើនឡើងច្រើន
When we are assessing a child for a placement decision, there are a lot of things that we have to factor in. Of course, we do need to consider the services that a child needs, but it's also really important to consider the value of a family.
កុមារដែលគាត់នៅក្នុងគ្រួសារគឺគាត់មានលទ្ធភាពនៅក្នុងការលូតលាស់និងមានឱកាសលូតលាស់ដូចក្មេងដទៃទៀតជាជាងដែលយើងយកគាត់ទៅថែទាំនៅក្នុងមណ្ឌល
As a larger community, it's really important that we advocate for development of more services that families have access to, because not only children who are in alternative care, but just children in their own families in any community are needing access to those services.
បើសិនជានៅក្នុងអង្គការកុមារក្នុងគ្រួសារអត់មានគម្រោង able ខ្ញុំគិតថាប្រហែលជាកុមារនឹងប្រឈមមុខនៅក្នុងការដាក់មណ្ឌលច្រើនកុមារប្រឈមមុខនឹងការបោះបង់ចោលគ្មានការយកចិត្តទុកដាក់ពីគ្រួសារនិងសហគមន៍
You can see that it's a very grassroots program. It doesn't look fancy. It's just in rural communities. But as a result of children and families developing the ABLE program, they are seeing children with disabilities, a range of different disabilities and a range of different needs, being taken into foster families. Many of them long-term foster families, which equates in Cambodia at this point in time to a domestic adoption type situation. We are seeing families who aren't giving their children up into institutions because they can receive this type of support. And so it's a critical service, but it was an absolute gap. And everyone in Cambodia was saying, oh, we're just going to have to invest in lots of group homes for children with disabilities because there's no services. But children and families stood up and said, no, we're going to develop that service. We're going to show you that this can work. Children with disabilities in this country, in this economic climate, in this cultural climate where they're not valued, where they're told they're second-class citizens, when they're told that they are cursed and have bad karma, we are going to show you that these children can be loved and accepted and supported in families. And now because they took a brave step of stepping into a gap in the system, trialing, learning, you can see reflected in the video, she's saying, we learnt this, we tried this and we learnt this. And then sharing that learning and evidence. Now we have a replicable model in Cambodia that can show us that we can support these children to be in family-based care as with all children. And that's what I really want to encourage you to do, is to not look at those gaps and feel discouraged, but feel challenged and be bold to step into them. Because I believe that's part of what the church is called to do. If we know we've got a big God on our side, we should be the first ones who look at those gaps and say, I'm up for that challenge. Because it may look like it exceeds my capacity, but it doesn't exceed the capacity of my God. And so we should be the ones that are stepping into those gaps, taking up those hard challenges so that that gap in the system can be plugged and all children can be supported according to their needs and best interests, and in most cases, in a family. So I'm going to turn over now to, for whatever time we have left, any questions, comments, any feedback. Some of you in the room may have great examples of your own, of how you've done just that, looked at a gap area and addressed it in your own country, and you would be very welcome to also share those examples in the time we have left. Yes.
So I was last week in Sri Lanka training with a network of homes, and one of the places they're struggling is, I was talking with them around gatekeeping, and they had a question that I was stuck on, and so I wondered if you could maybe help. So from their perspective, releasing the children back into families requires that set of services that you're talking about. And so they're saying it feels premature to release them back without that set of services, so shouldn't we wait for the services to be built before? It's almost like you're sending kids into a house that's still being built, metaphorically, and I wasn't sure because So I encouraged them. I'm encouraged by what you just said. I said, why don't you start, see then if you know where those gaps are, there are places where parts of your children's home could morph to that. But I just wondered if you could speak to that, because it feels a little chicken and egg-esque
it is
on the
chicken
ground.
and egg,
Yeah.
and it is one of the livest tensions in this space right now, is we have a tension between the long term and the immediate. the kids who are right now needing to get out of those institutions and the deficit of services to support that, and the reality that if we don't shift the investment, we'll never get there. And so that's where we have this real tension right now. And I think an example I can give to speak to that. So there is going to be a lot of complexity in that, and a lot of challenges in that. And there are going to be situations where you really have to weigh up the risks. You're not going to necessarily have an ideal situation for every case in this reform process. But if we don't move, we won't ever get there. So we sometimes have to look at the risks and weigh them up and say, well, okay, how do we use the resources we have? How do we tap into other organisations and lean on each other to get support for those families? Because we can't do everything that they might need to ensure family care is safe for them. How do we utilise others? How do we collaborate? But we also have to look at, what can we put in place to minimise those risks and to bring them down. But then we also have to, once we've done that, once we've looked at how we bring the risks down with the resources we have to then weigh it up and go, which set of risk is higher? Institutionalisation or returning to that family with the supports that we can put in place. Because I think one of the challenges is we often still assign neutral risk to institutions. And that's not true. There are huge risks associated with being in those institutions. But when we look at the risks in community and we pretend that the risks in institutions don't exist, often the decisions we're making with the resources we have is actually unbalanced. And so I'm not saying that you're going to be able to get a perfect scenario in every case, because right now when we're reforming the systems, the unfortunate reality is we won't. But we have to shift the resources, because if we don't, we won't get there. The best way to manage that reality and that tension is to be collaborative. So for example, in a program in Myanmar, where this is absolutely the case, these kids are coming from all the remote communities up in Chin State and Kachin State. Some of them are coming from the conflict areas. They're all in Yangon institutions. So when we talk about sending these kids back, you are talking about a huge, diverse area and lots of communities. So the amount of funding going into one given institution can't possibly meet the range of needs for children spread out all over the north of the country. So what we did is we got a group of institutions together. We got them all to map where the communities of origin of the children were. We got the social workers to do all the assessments and work out the viabilities of placements back in family. And then we looked at the entire budgets of all of the institutions. We brought in a network of Christian organisations who already had a vision and a mandate to do things like building schools in remote areas, providing primary health care, particularly out of churches and things like that. We approached them, we created a community of practice, and we said, will you support this work to do your programs in these communities where these children need to reintegrate? If any one of those orphanages had tried to do that independently, there's no way. But when they did it collectively, they started to realise the kids were coming from groupings of areas across multiple institutions. So that meant that, you could pool your resources, and if you needed to have a social worker based in one community, that social worker could help support children from 7 orphanages instead of 1. And so that meant your utilisation of your resource becomes much more strategic. And then again, doing that in collaboration with your government. So the answer to it is that it's difficult. There's going to be gaps. There's going to be consequences of those gaps, but the only way to move forward is to do it collaboratively. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. I just have a question about a lot of the things we see. We work with children without families and also teen mums. So many of our teen mums and youth at risk and teenagers who've grown up in care of some sort, are coming from an abusive background.
Uh-huh.
And then what we're sometimes seeing is mum has a baby, and then mum and baby together actually go back to the family where the mum has actually grown up and been abused growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because we don't really have a continuum of care. It's kind of like, one or the other. It's either separating mum and baby forever or putting them back with this kind of abusive family. And I was just sort of wondering what your thoughts on, what would be a good holding space? So we need to break this generational cycle of abuse, but we're actually just almost
putting them back in that same position. Yeah. Again, that comes back to looking at your services, and there's going to be a service system answer to that question, and there's going to be a case level answer to that question. So in terms of the services and the system, you need to look at, again, some of those mothers who are a little bit older, who are in their late teens or who are adults, they're not minors anymore, or at those borderline minor ages, they might be able to benefit from social housing in some countries, for example. So we have programs in Australia where teen mums, they might go into a residential program for a period of time to learn those life skills, and then they would be high priority for accessing social housing and accessing intensive family support services. So in our country, they would be immediately tagged on a program at pre-birth that would give them intensive social work support access probably throughout the first 6 months, and it's an ongoing referral. And they would be priority access to a number of other services, both in the family welfare system and in the social protection system, on the basis of that particular set of vulnerabilities that particular person would be demonstrating. So it's multiple places across the system. If you're looking at that from that doesn't exist and we've got these live cases, so developing things like, again, can we use that money to be able to have access to housing for those women in community rather than putting them in institutions or sending them back? Do we have a hybrid? Can we be using that money to rent rooms or rent a house or whatever it might be, but to provide them access to normal housing in community and then use resources to wrap social work services around them to make sure we're supporting them, things like that. There are countries that do specialised foster care. Particularly if you've got the not younger children, but younger teens who find themselves in situations of crisis pregnancy. Cambodia, are you from Mother's Choice by any chance? Yes, so your partner in Cambodia obviously have had some cases like that, and sometimes the baby's gone to a kinship carer, or sometimes they've had the specialised foster care who's taken the 12 or 13-year-old child who's pregnant into foster care that's both for the child, the baby, and the child who's also now a mother. And so you'll see those kinds of services, and sometimes they're popping up at case-by-case level. It's a creative response to that situation. But it's really about making sure that we've got flexible use of our resources. So we've got resources at hand, because what can happen is if they all get invested in these very institutional responses, when we have these cases, we've got no flexibility in our ability to come up with creative responses to these situations. Whereas if we've got more fluid resources that we can use, we can innovate. And say, okay, in this case, she's old enough and her position and her stability is enough that we could probably rent a house and have someone close by who checks on her and her baby, and we have a social worker who's daily visiting her for a period of time. In other cases, we actually might need to place this person and the baby in a family for a period of time. In another case, it might be that baby actually needs to go into alternative care, but we want to make sure mum's got stacks of contact, really close contact. So if you've got pots of resources that aren't so embedded in programs that you can use to make more reflective and responsive decisions, is also another way to get around it whilst those systems are being developed.
Thank you. I have 2 comments. One, I would like to thank you for, you are really very fun with your mind. You know what you are presenting. Another one, I would like to encourage all the members here that experience is not what happens to man, but what man does to what happens to him. One American inventor, I think Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulbs, tried 1,000 times and failed. But when he was asked by one journalist how he felt failing 1,000 times, he said he never failed 1,000 times, but the bulb was invented within 1,000 steps. So we shall find challenges, but if we are persistent and consistent, we shall overcome such challenges. Thank you very much.
It's such a great reflection. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and I think that really reflects the sentiment of this, is that we know there are huge issues with this. We know there are huge challenges with this, but we've got to jump in. We've got to stop being the community that buries our head in the sand and does what we've always done. We've got to start just really engaging with these issues towards that vision of having a really strong and effective system for children. And it's like you said, it's probably going to come with a whole lot of steps. Failures reframed as steps. I like that, to get there, but we have to be willing to jump in and do that. It's great.
Hello to everyone. I'm from India. My name is Bhavtosh. Um, in India, like nowadays, very hard to run orphanages and children homes and like a foster care or doing ministry among the children, because nowadays I think a previous few years Indian government has been shut down many Christian orphanages, and nowadays if you want to run an orphanage or children home, you have to go through the very hard process. You have to get the permission from the government. Permission is very difficult, a very hard process. And as I'm involved in children ministry, so I don't have permission to run the orphanages or children home. So we are trying to do the children ministry, the street children, work among the street children. So they will stay with their parents, and we are doing the fostering care, and we are admit them to school. They're going to school, and we are providing their fee, their stuffs, all these things. But we are facing, and there. But when other people see, they put allegation on us that these people, Christian people, are trying to convert them in Christianity. So this kind of we are in India. We are facing lots of problem, I think, everywhere. So they are trying. The Hindus, they don't want to help them, but we are willing to help them, but they are keeping them away from.
That's a really difficult issue in India right now.
Very difficult issue.
Yeah.
And this Modi government is trying to, I think, shut down all the Christians NGOs, trying slowly. Previous, I think, as per the estimation, last 5 years, more than 10,000 NGOs has shut down, and still he's trying. So, yeah. And many FCRA has been cancelled.
Yeah.
So we are India is struggling.
Yeah.
I don't know what will happen, because Modi has came next 5 years.
Yeah.
More he just elected as a prime minister. I don't know what would be happen next. So
And I think that's a situation that is.
We can't do anything.
Yeah.
We try to do.
Yeah.
They put allegation, and many pastors are in the jail now.
Yeah.
They're putting false allegation on them.
Yeah. But I think that's an issue that's affecting, all Christian organizations, not just those that are involved with children. It's a situation of persecution in your country right now. And I think in those situations, that's where we get down on our knees, right? That's when we go back to God and we pray and we try to be that loving example in our communities that will break through those barriers of persecution and of being considered the other in those communities. And that's the only way forward. But yes, I've been tracking with that in India over the last few years and very much feel for the Christian organizations there. It's a very difficult space to work at this point in time. So our prayers are definitely with you. Thank you. All right, well, we're at time. Did you have a quick question? Was that a hand up? No? Did you want to just quickly, last question? Okay, or comment, whatever it might be, and then we're going to wrap up.
Right. I'm from Uganda. From Uganda, and I ran an orphanage, and they're being appreciative of your elaboration and all your help. And in Uganda, we have lots of laws.
Yes.
As to run the orphanages, and they helping the children and resettling them.
Yep.
And I'm asking whereby, because we have cultural issues, and we have many foreigners coming in each country with its obligations and everything. So in place, we find that you kind of divided which culture can we take. Yeah, so because each country delegates comes in with their own culture. They want kind of you have not to do this, you have to do this, you have to do that. And those are two issues, the government situation and the culture from other cultures.
Yes, so I think that's why, again, back to an earlier point I made about let's not cookie cut. Let's develop local expressions of principle-based ideas, but they have to be coming out of that culture. They have to be relevant to that culture and that community. And so I agree with you, we need a greater degree of anthropology factored into the way we are developing systems, developing interventions. They need to be culturally grounded and embedded. So I fully support that comment in terms of, we're not about this should not be about bringing in one culture's answer. This should be about understanding some broad principles that are relevant, but we each need to find an expression of that in our own communities and cultures. So thank you for that comment.